crucial matter for many countries, for educational institutions, for the industry, because we see a gap growing between what industry requires and what institutions are producing in our graduates. So we look into some of the key stakeholders in this national quality process. We look into some of these factors here, and we'll try to look into what improvements can be done. This is a very vast topic and subject, but we will try our best to get the essence of our meeting today. So let's start with the concept of learning, and that it's not a simplistic process. It does not happen in a vacuum. It cannot be achieved with an arbitrary or ad hoc approach. There are many interconnected factors: learning environment, technology, instructor qualifications, empathy, feelings, attitudes, learner behaviors, assessment methods, feedback processes. So we do need to operate with some kind of learning models. So we will go into details of what these could be. And we are in essence talking about holistic education. And with OBE and transformational OBE especially, we are focused very much with holistic education, which is a complex process considering students as whole persons, involving development of their knowledge, skills, and values. Learning models represent complex educational processes in a simplified manner, creating a holistic view of teaching and learning, thereby providing frameworks for research and improvement of learning. And these are very essential. And you see now, especially after COVID, we have hybrid learning. We have a combination of remote and face-to-face learning. We have flexible schedules. We have social distancing, blended learning. So all of this put together, learning models are more necessary than ever. Now, with our expertise and several years of work in the education and industry, these are the four essential, very, very critical components of bringing skills successfully into education. One is a well-defined and accurate learning model, the right instruction strategy, a quality improvement process that regulates, implements, and assures the management of the whole education system and process to produce the graduates we need. And another very, very critical component, which is still very missing today, is digital technology, the right digital technology to bring all this together. So let's start with learning models. We'll start with John Carroll's radical learning model, the school learning model, which redefined how we look at aptitude. Now, he defined aptitude as the time allocated for learning, the opportunity of learning, multiplied by the engagement rate or perseverance of students. That's the time spent, divided by the time needed. So, what's learning? Aptitude of learning is the rate of learning, basically. So, he's saying it's the time spent by the time needed. The time needed would be the ability of students to understand and the quality of instruction. So these are the different variables in this. So time would be a resource. It would not be a basis for learning. It's a resource. So it has to be used in that sense. And we talked about the degree of learning. The key thing here is the instruction time or the allocated time would be a key resource offering the opportunity to learn. The time needed for students to learn depends on their aptitude, the quality of instruction they receive, and their ability to understand instruction. So, given everything else uh, equal or constant, if you increase the learning time, then it would result in increased learning. So, amount of instruction would be one of the key decisions for policymakers. Now, why is this important? Because I've seen some countries, they actually take student learning time as a basis for computing student overload. So they have three models. They have a diligent student that takes less time, 40 hours, and they have a normal student take 48 hours, and you could say a not so diligent student takes 55 hours for one credit hour of learning. And so they make up this model. And so if the hours of learning are more, they say it's overloading the educational system. But that goes directly in contrast with Carroll's model, which says that if you increase learning time, there's more learning. So there's a big contrast over there. So going from John Carroll, we come to Benjamin Bloom, and Benjamin Bloom took a lot of, you could say, feedback from John Carroll. And so what happened in 1971 to 1981 was that Benjamin Bloom took the concepts from John Carroll, and which is essentially that all students can learn, but they will differ in the rates of their mastery, and that could be quite a big of a difference. And so they needed different amounts of time in different learning domains. So under the influence of Ralph Tyler, Bloom recognized that what is important in education wasn't that students should not be compared. But you see now the whole education is about comparison. But students should be assisted to achieve their goals of learning. So goal attainment and student was what was really critical, and not student comparison. So in mastery learning, the process of teaching needed to be geared toward designing tasks that could progressively lead to realization of the objects of objectives of learning. So back in 1960s and 70s, there was a avalanche of change in the U.S. with 20 states following Oregon's decision to align towards competency-based education, and Oregon was challenging the validity of using time and course credits as basis for certifying student accomplishment, and was also questioning the relevance of kind of curricula to the life role demands students would face after graduation. So in 1978, Sparry and Mitchell coined the word outcome-based education in organizational context for implementing outcome-based education. That's 1978, July, August. So now they really did not stand against competency, but they said there were other components like social responsibility, social integration, personal development, the affective domain elements, the interpersonal skills, the life performance rules. So this what actually stood out from just disparate skills and just technical skills of the competency-based education model. So what they coined was the transformational OBE model in 1991, wherein clarity of focus, that outcomes have to be defined and designed down first in class, expanded opportunities where time was a resource and not a base. When the time runs out, then students can't learn. That didn't exist. So instructional coaching was valued rather than sage on a stage and being unidirectional in teaching. Now, what was really valued was this same concept that was echoed by John Carroll and by Benjamin Bloom, that all students can learn, and they can learn life force. But the key question was not on the same day and not in the same way. So we had in transformational OB key outcomes like collaborative workers, quality producers, involved citizens, self-directed achievers, adaptable problem solvers. So these are live performance roles that were well defined in Bill's book, Choosing Outcomes of Significance, 1994. So we look at the timeline here for OB, John Carroll's 1963 school learning and redefinition of aptitude, Bloom's learning for mastery, Benjamin Bloom, 1968, then OB's traditional by William Spenn, 1978, and the OB transformational, 1991 to now, and of course there are more changes. So we're just going to go over a few of the major core concepts, because when you understand these core concepts, it becomes very relevant and helpful for us to design national quality systems and to bridge the skills gap. So there are major issues and you can say deficiencies in some of these understandings and implementation models. So it could actually help clear that. Now, the keys to having an outcome-based system are developing a clear set of learning outcomes around which all the system's components can be focused. That's number one. Establishing conditions and opportunities in the system that enable and encourage all students to achieve those essential outcomes. Then OB's two key purposes, which is reflecting the underlying success for all students and staff philosophy are number one, ensuring that all students are equipped with the knowledge, competence, and qualities needed to be successful after they exit the education system. Now, the key thing is all students. Now, when we go further, we'll understand how this really doesn't happen sometimes, actually, in a number of places. And then structuring operating schools so that these outcomes can be achieved and maximized. Then we go to the three premises of OB model. All students can learn and succeed, but not on the same day and not in the same way. Successful learning promotes even more successful learning. Again, structuring it, the hierarchy, the connections and alignment is very critical. Schools control the conditions that directly affect successful school learning. So these are the areas of focus. Coming to the power principles, clarity of focus, that a clear picture of the demonstration of the performance activity, learning activity, and then that becomes a top priority for instructional planning and student assessment. Outcome is the starting point for curriculum and for assessment. And the desired outcome is the starting point for curriculum, instruction, assessment, planning, and implementation. That's the starting point, and everything must align perfectly. Instruction process in the classroom begins with the teacher sharing, explaining, and modeling the outcome. So on day one and continuing thereafter, there's no surprise philosophy, no surprises philosophy of OBN, like the shock treatment of sudden pop examinations with things which are asked from students which actually haven't been taught. That doesn't exist in the OB model. Expanded opportunity, again, time is a resource. It's not a basis. We have to reorganize time, learning time, expanding the duration, frequency, and timing of learning. Methods and modalities have to align to more successful learning and involve and empower students, operational principles. These things should be consistent, not random, ad hoc, spasmodic, but rather they should be consistent. So with this, basically all aligned uh, together, we will be able to enable expand opportunity. Performance standards should be you know criterion based and not comparative. There's no comparative kind of standards in outcome-based education models, and clearly they're very limiting and limit the chance of success for many students. The curriculum should be very well accessible and very well structured so that the lower order of learning to higher order of learning is quite spontaneous in the educational process. So we have to raise standards and high expectations of accepted performance, very clearly laid out. We have to eliminate success quotas, and that goes along with criterion-based standards, not comparative standards. We have to increase the access to high-level curriculum. And the last principle is design down, which is start with the significant culminating learning experience and use them as building blocks to build the whole structure of the curriculum and the learning experience. So you'll have culminating outcomes, enabling outcomes, and discrete outcomes. So which many people interpret as program, even course, and performance indicators. The second role, which is the golden rule of design down, is faculty must be willing to replace or eliminate parts of the curriculum which are not true enabling outcomes. So let's just sum it up in a nutshell. Traditional is purely based on the technical curriculum, focusing on curricular content and micro skills, minimal integration to higher order skills. When you go to transitional OB, it's higher order competencies for students to do complex things beyond the conventional content, and then also effective communication, investigative research, critical thinking, etc. Transitional outcomes are complex unstructured task performances, such as the creativity and innovation capabilities of students. So teachers have to go beyond the constraints of specific content matter. But when you move to transformational OB, we talk about context dominated outcomes of significance. So the community and job contexts become real, and the abilities of students to integrate and synthesize a complex array of content. And this is most challenging because for institutions, since there's a big gap between a dynamic workplace, community environment, and the current academic environment. So it also deals with a lot of emotional aspects in the affective domain and transformational OB, which can be basically developed through teacher-student intense relationship and a relationship that deals with real life performance roles. So I'm coming into Bloom's taxonomy, revisiting Bloom's, because we're going to be talking about learning progression. When learning progression is not accounted for in curriculum, in instruction, in national qualification systems or qualification frameworks, that can be very chaotic and very dangerous. Because it will lay down the rules, but it will not give you the steps to come up to that minimal requirement of performance or qualification. So if you look here, we're looking in 1956 when Bloom first came up with the taxonomy of educational objectives. And we're looking at three domains here: cognitive, affective, psychomotor, which are very humanistic and very generic. So I'm not going to go into very much of the details and nitty-gritties of what's in all of these, but overall, the concept of learning progression and the different levels of learning is going to be the focus over here. So in the 2001 revision of the original Bloom's taxonomy, Anderson Catwall, they changed the nouns to verbs, and they basically exchanged the position of evaluation and creation or synthesis. So here you have the starting point is remembering, ability to recall, understanding, able to understand, applying basic fundamental, information, concepts, analyzing, separating a certain problem into its component parts, applying again fundamental concepts of solving, evaluating, basic judging, making a classification, making a characterization of some component, process, system, person. So that's evaluation, and creating is synthesis, putting things together, making a brand new process, system, component. So this is basically the levels of the cognitive. And when you go into Bloom's affective domain, it was also by Cratwall, Bloom in Asia, developed in 1973. We're looking at feelings, attitudes, values, motivation. So let me come with this one here. The first is receiving. These are the different learning levels in this particular model. A keen observation is these learning levels are not the Bible or religious scripture. However, we as learning, experts, pedagogy experts, assessment experts, we recommend you to develop your own learning levels, which are very relevant for your specialization and the stage of learning. So you have receiving over here, which is the awareness and willingness to hear and its selected attention. Then responding, you have some response and active participation on part of the learners. Then you have the third level, valuing. A value or worth is attached to a certain object, concept, phenomena, etc. And then you go to organization, where now learners are able to arrange these values in certain order. And finally, you go to internalization, where the value system controls the behavior of the learner. And there is a distinct, pervasive, and consistent and predictable behavior and characteristic of the student, which is very, very clear, distinct, and it's observable. So now we go to the psychomotor domain, and in the psychomotor domain, we have some levels that can sort of match with what we saw in the affect domain. We have perception, ability to use sensory cues, and then we have the capability to act on several kinds of sets of situations, whether mental, physical, emotional. Then there's a guided response, which are basically a complex skill that involves imitation of a certain model and a live performance, and this could be some trial and error there. So there's perception, response to sensory cues, response to stimuli, then there's readiness to act even before the stimuli happens. There is some basic readiness from the learner, and there's guided response. Then there's mechanism, there's level of automation, and which becomes kind of habitual, and there's a level of proficiency here. Then you have uh, actually there's another one which is maybe missing in this slide. It's called complex overt response, which is a higher level of proficiency and confidence displayed by the learner in the psychomotor skill. Adaptation is basically taking those skills and applying them in a different pattern or a different environment, and originally creating brand new, psychomotor uh, activity patterns for certain problems. So these are the 7 levels of the Simpsons psychomotor domain developed 1972. You may well note that some of these may not apply to your specific specialization. So this is very crucial, and that's why we say national qualification frameworks should be sector aligned, and they should not be so generic, because otherwise it will be very difficult to extract information by institutions, educators, and to basically reach to that point. So mastery learning, we just looked into all those 3 different domains of learning, and we talked about the learning levels, and the idea is to give the capability for this learning progression and go step by step and develop to higher order skills, higher order outcomes, higher order competencies. So this is in a nutshell what we discussed about the principles paradigm of outcome-based education, the 3 domains, learning progression, because this is all very, very crucial. I would stop in a couple of minutes after I discuss this aspect of learning domains. All whatever I discussed so far is very crucial to understanding what learning domains are. Learning domains are utilized by national qualification systems to identify major learning domain categories which they want a country, learners and graduates to focus on to achieve. And within each of these learning domains, there could be different types and categories of skills and competencies, behaviors, and levels of performances that could be very clearly articulated. So I'm giving you this model, which we call learning domains wheel. It's a very important model. We developed that using Venn diagrams. And if you see over here, we put in the Bloom's psychomotor, affective, and cognitive, and got a very nice model here. And we have minimal overlap. Basically, we use this model to try to look into the overlap and redundancy between learning domains. For example, a country says, okay, we want numerical skills to be a learning domain for our students. And then we also want problem solving. Now, if you apply that to engineering, and if you apply that to some science majors and computing and other majors, you don't see solving actually happening without numeric skills. So numeric skills becomes actually a subset of problem solving. And when you create problem solving and numeric skills as 2 distinct learning domains, there's so much overlap here in between these two, that creating outcomes, creating the assessment, evaluating those, implementing these in learning structures and systems becomes a very big hassle, and in fact, I would say a ridiculous effort. So the same goes for teamwork and leadership. Leadership is very important, but it's a component of teamwork. So when you have teamwork and leadership as 2 different domains by a country defined as 2 different learnings, you'll again end up with a lot of redundancy there. So that's the reason why we have to be actually very careful and how we define these learning domains, do not have learning domains which are subsets of one another. They could be a small overlap, but not a major overlap that could basically destroy the whole purpose of having learning domains and learning levels. So, and this is actually what happened. And if you see this country, it had this following learning domains: knowledge, cognitive skills, psychomotor, you see information technology. So they had a lot of problems and a lot of redundancy that was created and a lot of form filling, and really did not implement into learning, into assessment, producing real quality. So there was a major shift, but that shift took several years. So these kind of mistakes, we see that commonly happen. And we'd like to talk about this now so that later on we could address the reason to why we have the skills gap, and what are the factors and how can we eliminate those factors. One country, it selected lifelong learning skills as a learning domain because lifelong learning skills is a buzzword. Don't go by the buzzwords, go by the details of what are the components of learning of even those buzzwords like lifelong learning. According to Michael McGirra's 2015 research, lifelong learning, it depends on student thinking, student self-management, and student social interaction. Three aspects. So if you look at student thinking, you're looking at problem solving, critical thinking. If you're looking at self-management, mindsets, self-regulation, conscientiousness, motivation. If you look at social interaction, it's emotional skills, social life. So this country, it took lifelong learning skills, made it one part of the learning domain, it took problem solving. But in fact, problem solving would be a subset of lifelong learning if it is done accurate. So the frameworks for developing the learning domains resulted in inaccuracies and redundancies, which will go back to affect the implementation. This is basically how to acquire lifelong learning skills. I'm not going to go into this, but it's just listed here. You can always go back into the video and check this out by pausing on that. Because of time limitation, I will move forward. So to sum it up, we have instructional models, transmissive model. So we have a solo teacher to a student unidirectional model, and there's content. Then we have transactional model. It's a bidirectional model. So teaching, learning, bidirectional between the student and instructor. The teaching style, modes of teaching, assessment, all affect the transaction, the environment, content, all affect the transaction. So that's the transactional model, where there's some kind of transaction between all of these different elements and components of learning. So the other thing is the transformational model. Duncan and Bill, 1974. Now, this model had enormous impact on the field of educational research because it provided a theoretical framework and vocabulary. Now, in this model, it has preset variables, which are the teacher-related aspects, the skills of teacher, the training experience of teacher, and the formative experience of teacher, how the teacher would also develop and be progressively learning about offering enhanced and better instruction for students. And the context variables are the pupil context and the community, classroom, and school context, all of that now summed up together in the process variables, where you have teacher, classroom behavior, pupil, classroom behavior, observable changes in pupil behavior. So the emotional aspects and attitudes and the interactions of environment, teacher, and the student, and their backgrounds, plus their progressive development, all of that is encountered and considered for the short-term immediate pupil learning effects and the long-term pupil learning. So that's the most effective model of learning, and that's all summed up here. I'm not going to go into these details. I'm going to leave the slide for you to go back and reference it from the video. So simply putting it, we have outcomes which are the basis to decide, how teaching, how assessment, and how improvement would happen. So this is the Gage and Burnett model. So you have an instruction sequence beginning with before instruction, where you plan out the outcomes of teaching, you understand the characteristics and other variables. Then during instruction, you basically learn about how to apply instructional strategies, motivate students, and result in a better learning, then you consistently choose and apply the best methods of teaching, and you conduct formative and summative assessments to evaluate the performance as well as the success of the instructional strategy. So this is Gage and Berliner model of instruction. So all of these instruction models are here, are implementing basically the OB paradigm, but they're just different strategies. It could be format, it could be problem based, because we hear people saying, hey, problem based is better than outcome based, but that's not understanding this very clearly. So the outcomes would change, the assessment would change, the strategy would change, but outcomes would still be there. The paradigm, philosophy, and the component, the structure is still there. So with that said, I'm here now, Sumit, to take a few questions. Sumit, if we have some questions, we can take them now. Hello?
Hello, sir.
Sumit?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Are there any questions that we can take now?
Yeah, I'm here, sir. One second, sir. So I have asked the questions, but not yet received. If anything else like that, I'll reply you.
Okay, so there are no questions right now.
Yes, sir. Right now there are no questions.
Okay, so we will basically proceed
Sure, sir. Sure.
to our next part. So Sumit, just be alert, just look at the questions, and you can even ask attendees to put the questions on the question tab. And if
Yes,
there's
sir.
any, then we will stop after another half an hour.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sure.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. Now, let's go back to our presentation. I've talked about the learning models. I've talked about John Carroll, Mastery Learning by Benjamin Bloom, and I've talked about Spaddy's outcome-based educational model and transformational OB, and also instructional aspects of learning. So now, when we go and look into curriculum, this is a very crucial part of integrating skills into students, the skills that we need, the emerging skills. For this, we do need to refer to market trends like World Economic Forum reports. We need to look into societal specialization-based societal, or discipline-related quality standards. We need to look into life performance roles, inculcate them. Maybe there's some national vision. We need to look into complex problem solving, real problems, collaboration, interpersonal, and entrepreneurship skills. So we look at this pyramid design. It's called the mountain climber design model, wherein the mountain climber actually starts at the peak of the mountain and then goes down towards the base, because the paths to the peak, they reduce as we go up towards the top. So that's why the mountain climber takes the best path by looking at the only path from peak down and goes down. And so it's called the mountain climber design down model. We're looking at the three domains of learning, which are the affective, cognitive, psychomotor. So it's holistic learning. We are designing down, looking, culminating outcomes. We look at the program educational objectives, which are basically what market needs, what society needs integrated, what the country needs integrated into outcomes. We bring that into program outcomes. We bring that into the different courses, and we take it in a certain structural way so that these skills, outcomes, and competences are found in our students. So this is how you do it. There's introductory courses, 200 level courses. There's 300 level courses, which are the reinforced courses, and 400 level courses, the mastery courses. So you're introducing concepts, knowledge, and fundamentals, you're reinforcing them, and you're taking them to competency and mastery. So when you look into introductory courses, you need to have a major proportion of elementary skills, a moderate proportion of intermediate skills, and a low proportion of advanced skills. Okay. So when you go to reinforced courses, then you have a moderate proportion of advanced skills, a high proportion of intermediate skills, and a low proportion of elementary skills. So you see here, skills and outcomes have to be structured. If you want to achieve a higher order of learning and competency, you have to make sure outcomes are structured and classified that way. And they're utilized by educators and students, because there has to be learning progression, a well-defined learning progression that is integrated and implemented all the way from a national prescription down to, you can say, the smallest level or educational system that exists in a country. So then you have mastery courses. We have the highest proportion of advanced skills and lowest proportion of elementary skills. Now, I have seen programs, even course modules with, you could say, courses having all skills at the intermediate level or all skills at the advanced level. So that basically means there's literally no real good definition of learning progression. And we don't even want to ask about the implementation aspect. So you see in the red shaded area, you have the introductory courses with high proportion of elementary skills, low proportion of advanced skills. And in the blue or greenish shaded area, you have the mastery courses with a high proportion of advanced skills and a low proportion of the elementary. So that's a nice shaded plot with all these verbs. The verbs are not exactly accurate, but this is just a representation of the idea behind the design of curriculum. So I've talked about structuring outcomes. So it's very important to know the difference between goals, objectives, outcomes, and maybe performance indicators. We're not talking about key performance indicators for institutional, outcomes or institutional performance, but we're talking about student-centered performance indicators, which is specific information of student learning and the performance skills. So goals are very broad. They contain language with future tense. They don't have action verbs in a certain real context, very specific context. On the other hand, program and course objectives, uh, they are basically also future tense, but they are more, you could say, student centered, program centered, and they are here to basically let students know and the education community know what's the objective of this particular educational program, what's the intention of the teacher. They show what the intentions of the teacher are and what the ambitions of the teacher are or the institution are. But when you come to outcomes, it's actually what students would demonstrate as the performance. So it would contain action verbs, it would contain specific context, a subject format, and the program or culminating outcomes or sometimes even enabling outcomes may not have the specific performance scales. These scales, you would find them in performance indicators. Now, performance indicators will be very, very specific. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side, you see all of these outcomes. You see the performance indicators, and you see the classification. So every outcome is electronically ID'd. Every performance indicator which helps fulfill the program outcome is electronically ID'd, and it's at a certain classification, a certain domain, and a certain level of learning. For example, you see cognitive analyzing, then you see cognitive evaluating, then you see cognitive applying, and then you could see psychomotor there, or affective as well. Effective, you could see internalizing, for example, or organizing values. So all of these are very, very critical, because without defining outcomes, having a structure for them, definition for these, you can attain learning progression. And we find this missing in many, many institutions. So coming to a very good sample is the Washington Accord engineering profiles. I talked about looking into accreditation bodies and yeah, and then the quality associations, organizations. And what we found out is that some of these societies and organizations actually offer a great spectrum of requirements. So let's look into the engineering profile. Washington Accord is actually for engineers. The Sydney Accord is for technologists, and the Dublin Accord is for technicians. So if you look at this, beautifully put out a range of problem solving. Now, what is the range of problem solving? What kind of wide-ranging technical engineering methods we look into? And then, do they have any obvious solution or not? And how often do you encounter these issues? And are these covered by any standards and codes of practice? And how many kinds of stakeholders and diverse groups of people do you need to contact to solve these problems? And do these problems have other subcomponents or sub-problems? What are the consequences of these problems? And how many would require some kind of a judgment? So that's the range of problem solving. Then the range of engineering activity is the kind of resources you'll have to use, the level of interaction that you have to make, the kind of innovation and creation that you have to produce, the consequences to society and environment. This is wonderful. So this is very, very comprehensive, and this helps to prepare the curriculum properly to give the mindset and the comprehension for holistic education and for the graduates we need for the industry, and not just the industry, for the country and for the world. So bravo to these profiles from Washington Accord, Sydney Accord, and Dublin Accord. Wonderful. And this is the knowledge profile. It also tells you what kind of knowledge is required. Is it theory-based, understand natural sciences, the knowledge connected with fundamental mathematics and those details, engineering fundamentals, engineering specialist knowledge, engineering design knowledge, engineering practice and technology knowledge, comprehension of realistic constraints like societal, economic, cultural, environmental. So all of this is actually the profile of knowledge that we have to inculcate. Now, I'm showing you this to reason with you to understand that with every specialization, these profiles are different. And that's why you cannot have a generic definition at a country level and everybody, every specialization follows that. But that doesn't produce the skills that we need, doesn't produce the right accreditation standards, doesn't help in relating that with national testing. So all of this has to be incorporated properly into curriculum and the educational system. Now, these are different uh, graduate attributes, and all of the engineering schools that apply to these have to prepare outcomes that cover these in some format or another. So this is competency, and this is the minimum standard of competence that is expected from a graduate, either an engineer, a technologist, or technician. And so it talks about knowledge and application of knowledge, problem analysis, design and development of solutions, evaluation, protection of society, legal, communication. So this is very nice minimum standards, you could say, that has been laid out by the International Engineering Alliance. So how do you do this into curriculum? You have your whole required curriculum structure, you have your courses, electives, core courses, and you have the basic content. Then you identify the key emerging skills like lifelong learning or something else, and then you align this with the quality agency attributes like the International Engineering Alliance or Washington Accord. From there, you go into curriculum, you identify those courses where you can plug these in, but you have to achieve a progressive learning all the way up to higher order competencies. So you select a An introductory course, introduce some introductory aspects of that particular skill. Then you go to a follow-up course, which would be at the reinforced level, 300 level. You bring in concepts of reinforcing those learning skills, and then you go to a mastery course, to a 400 level course, and try to achieve competence. So you have to design that for every aspect of an outcome, skill, a competence. Look into the whole content and apply this wherever it is possible. For example, critical thinking or design. Where does it get introduced? Where would it get reinforced, and how would you take it to its maximum potential? The same goes for communication, teamwork. So you'd have to identify and link curriculum so there's a progression happening. So talking about all of this, the third aspect is quality. We talked about learning models, instructional aspects, now quality. We'll have to talk about quality to the gurus of quality, which are three big gurus. There are several gurus, but I'd like to refer to the three big ones here, which are essentially, uh, three big giants, and those are Edwards Deming. Sorry, just a little message. Edwards Deming, Joseph Juran, and Phil Crosby. All of these were very influential in the post World War II development of Japan, and you know about Toyota and how they have pretty much uh, made a hallmark for their quality systems and their application of these principles of quality in the entire world. So if you look at Stout's view, what is quality? It's performance by expectation. What's the performance and what's the standard? A comparison of these two. So we look into quality management as four main components: quality planning, quality control, quality assurance, and quality improvement. And quality management is not only on the product and service of quality, but also the means to achieve it. Quality management uses quality assurance and control of processes as well as products to achieve more consistent quality. And quality control is a process by which there is a review and check of all the quality factors involved in production. So this approach places emphasis on three aspects: controls such as job management, well-defined processes, performance, integrity criteria, identification of records, competence such as knowledge, skills, experience, qualifications, soft elements such as motivation, team spirit, attitudes, relationships. So all of these would be areas of coverage for quality control. Now, quality assurance is a way of preventing mistakes or defects in manufactured products and avoiding problems when delivering solution services to customers. So it is applied to pre-production. In our case, it's when you apply this to education, you're looking into all of the quality and accreditation aspects where you have all these standards and systems in place to guarantee and ensure that we meet the graduate attributes, meet the requirements of curriculum, infrastructure, faculty, facilities that are required to achieve the right kind of students that we need for the industry, for the country, and for the world today. So finally, it refers to administrative and procedural activities implemented in a quality system. So Deming in the 1950s, actually he took this from Walter Shewhart, who was a Bell laboratory scientist in 1920s who developed the PDCA cycle. But Walter Shewhart was a mentor of Edwards Deming. So in 1950s, Edwards Deming proposed that business processes should be analyzed and measured to look at variation. So, a whole business system, all the various critical business processes should have mechanisms in place to analyze the sources of variation that could cause product defects and deviate from customer requirements. So what was created was the plan, do, check, act quality cycle, where you plan uh, or devise the process, where you implement this plan and you check and assess this, compare it with some standards, and then you act on the corrective actions. And then this is an infinite cycle. It's continuous feedback loop that goes on and on. So in education, you have standards for programs and curricula. Then you assess those educational needs, gather feedback from stakeholders, and apply that to improve education. So with that said, we go into a critical aspect of educational institutions, with critical quality aspect, which is assessment cycles. So when we talk about manual systems, which are not digitized, so we see that a lot of manual systems and their quality cycles are very compartmentalized and disconnected. They're too lengthy to result in real improvement. Any educational system's quality cycle could run several years and beyond the lifespan of a student learning cycle. So it would be impractical to trace failures and implement on-time corrective actions. It's not learner-centered, and they do not consist of quality cycles with a productive causal flow, resulting in continuous improvement. I'll give you some examples. When we looked at all those instructional and looked at those different learning models, now we come to ABIT's continuous improvement and assessment model here. This is an expansion of the previous models, but the key concept which is here is the continuous improvement and the efforts for continuous improvement following with assessment, evaluation, feedback, and application of those feedback elements into corrective actions. So you find these loops very clearly indicated, and this is the very crucial aspect of outcome-based educational systems, is to be able to achieve effective continuous improvement. However, some of the drawbacks in this particular model is generic outcomes, generic performance indicators, which makes it difficult to align accurately with instruction assessment, because we deal with several hundred specific skills when you talk about undergrad students in any specialization. If you take engineering, there are several hundred of these. If you now look into Gloria Rogers' model, you have 6 outcomes mentioned in this particular array. This is a 2004 assessment planning flowchart from Gloria Rogers training. And then you see here that the data collection process takes 3 years. And if you have more outcomes, that could pretty much double. So you see every outcome is basically assessed every 3 years. But the question is, well, if we want students to improve, how do you connect these observances to student failure? And how do you create the corrective action to deal with students real time and address their issues? So that becomes quite problematic, and it starts shifting from student-centered models to program-centered models. So these are the issues with assessment. So each outcome has all these different stages. You have performance criteria that define an outcome. You have educational strategies related to these performance criteria. You basically review mapping, correct? You review mapping and identify where data will be collected, and you look into how to review these assessment methods. You collect data, you evaluate assessment data, you report findings, you take action when necessary. So all of these are the various, you can say, quality phases and quality actions related to a certain outcome. These are the assessment evaluation activity related to that particular outcome. But you see, it could basically spread out into several years, and that may not at all help individualized student performances, on-time real performances, enhancement of students, because it goes out of that cycle. It's not happening real time. The information is not available. So this is basically most of this is the manual aspect of evaluation, assessment, and quality for education systems. So this is summed up here, a 3 assessment cycle, and easily when you increase the number of outcomes, that would exponentially increase the time frame. So the data collection, evaluation, and improvement goes over several years, whereas we need to take action on the spot, sometimes within courses, within days, within weeks, within a certain term. And so when we stretch out into a whole year, that will be quite impractical to get the uh, implementation aspect of skills into students, and to address problems at the right time. Now, here's another more practical model wherein, yes, you have those cycles, you have PEOs being evaluated every 5 years, you have the program level outcomes evaluated every 3 years for change. Now, these are for change. And then you are reviewing the performance indicators also every 3 years. But at the core, in day-to-day teaching, all of these are assessed. You assess the student outcomes, you assess the program outcomes, you assess the specific PI. So all of them assessed. This is from a digitized model, and corrective actions are basically collected on the fly, are presented to instructors in dashboards, and action for improvement can happen very, very quickly. So that's a very crucial part of the implementation of our aspect of skills into education, digital technology and automation. It has to be based on perfectly aligned theoretical, conceptual, and practical frameworks. So you can't just pick up and take any kind of digital technology. The learning models, the classification of learning progression, the way evaluation and assessment happens, and whether you're picking up information from every student or not, this would be all crucial information. So you have 4 essential components of a successful digital technology. One is learning management system, other is outcomes assessment system, then academic advising systems, and continuous improvement management system. I'm going to go a little bit into this and explain to you what those mean, but quite briefly, because uh, giving you full details of that would in fact mean a completely different presentation and more time. So just looking into this particular figure here, it's from our paper, EBIT accreditation during after COVID-19, 2020 IEEE publication. So you see there are theoretical frameworks, there are conceptual frameworks, and there's practical frameworks. All of these have to be integrated in a certain hierarchical structure and implemented that way to create the digital platform, digital solution. So when you look at theoretical frameworks, you see OBE theory, philosophy, paradigm, principle. The essential aspects of OBE theory have to be there. If you look at conceptual framework, we have the best assessment practices. We have the accreditation assessment models. We have what we call as the 3-level skills grouping methodology, which basically defines skills into elementary, intermediate, and advanced skills. You have to have that progression. There has to be progression. There has to be design down mapping where the system actually implements the goals and objectives of the institution, going down to program level outcomes, student real performances, very specific performances, and a learning model. What are the domains? If technology doesn't give you the option of defining distinct domains and the levels of learning, just dump that technology. that technology is not going to be helpful in achieving learning. It's just going to bring information together to you, which may not make any sense. So the practical framework is basically implementing all of these aspects into advising, into evaluation, into rubrics, into course assessment, and taking all of the information, conducting evaluations at the program course level, producing actions, electronically indexing those actions, and sending them to committees or individuals for process, for following up on the corrective actions and producing those results. Some of them happen real time, some of them can happen a week later. So all of those could be prioritized with CIMS. You could mention clearly what's the time frame for the corrective action, who's responsible. It emerges from an outcome-based evaluation result. You have a failure in a certain outcome. You identify a certain breach or deviation or problem area, and then you also identify who could fix that and what it takes to fix it and the time to fix that. So all of that could happen with CIMS. So we're just showing you here in a model that we actually implemented. We have quality cycles. The quality cycles are interconnected. As we saw that assessment model, we have quality cycle one, curriculum design, course design, application of structured rubrics. Then we have quality cycle two, which is the application of all of this consistently. Remember, operational principles have to be consistently applied. So we apply that throughout the semester, which is Q2. Then when you go to Q3, we have a program evaluation. And in the program evaluation, we get the actions, and this particular actions, we implement them, we send them to administrative committees, which are those folders on the left-hand side under the CIMS, and all of these committees, they implement those actions. Then quality cycle four, at the end of 3 years, we review whether those performance indicators actually make sense or they don't make sense. And what should we do to improve them or change them or even dump them? They're not relevant. If you go to Q5, then we are looking into the multi-term results of program outcomes. We collect multi-term data. Multi-term data is very important for benchmarking, for adjusting the threshold of what's passed, what's failed, to see if something really needs to change. And then finally, we go to Q6, the mission and the information that feeds back into the program outcomes and the program objectives of the institutional program. Are they all making sense? Are we going in the right direction? What's the feedback from the stakeholders? So put that all into perspective. So we have 6 integrated embedded cycles. So that's very crucial for us. So sum it all up. This is the technology that should contain all of these various elements. So Dr. Sumit, I'm ready for some questions. So coming back to digital technology and the integration of LMS, OAS, CIMS, and AAS, we see a comprehensive digital technology required to achieve OBE. And CIMS is one of the key aspects, and I'm going to go over that with you in a little bit. But this is just a nice sum up of everything that's happening here. So advising and career counseling, outcomes information, learning management system, the syllabi, the course information, assessments, everything is beautifully listed out. And on the left-hand side, you see the CIMS. This is actually a meeting minute with electronically indexed actions, who are the members of the meeting, and then what are the decisions or results of actions. All of that is summed up in electronic records. So we've been able to achieve more than 1 million records as objective evidence in a matter of 7 years. So I'm not going to go with this, but I'm going to leave this, which you can refer back, rewind, and look into the slides and see these aspects and how we compared manual CQI processes with the automated aspects. We also have a remote audition feature with which we could actually be on the other part of the globe And once all the conceptual, theoretical, and practical frameworks in place, and you have a good system of implementation, all of these accreditation audits could happen, online as regards to the quality standards and as regards to several aspects of teaching and learning. So you see a million documents in the cloud. You can go into any kind of term. You can enter any kind of documentary evidence, and all in a matter of seconds. You can go from institution, program, from program, you can go all the way down to an individual student in a matter of seconds. But that would take another presentation from me. So I'm just giving you the snapshots here. So for CIMS, you see a beautiful repository of corrective actions, the committees responsible, the status of the action items, the meeting ID, the description of the action items, meeting minutes, all of that. So this is the most difficult part for schools to implement for accreditation, and that's possible seamlessly uh, and in quite much of a detail, and would really help implement continuous improvement because you have a CIMS implemented, which actually looks into outcomes evaluation, identifies failure, and can go into depths of identifying the sources of failure and developing corrective actions, and then electronically transmitting those and allocating those to specific people responsible to complete and following it up, have some traceability. So technology is imperative to be able to follow these gaps and to improve on skills and enhance them. The other thing is academic advising based on outcomes. Now, student advising has to be based on outcomes. You look at NACADA, the National Academy of Advising, University of Kansas, it says student advising should be based on outcomes and skills. But when we really look into research and exhaustive research, we rarely find academic advising is happening based on quantitative student outcomes results from direct assessments. It happens based on surveys and indirect assessment, but direct assessment information is very minimal. So if you use embedded assessments with performance vector technology, like the faculty course assessment report with John Estelle, you can grab the information for all students in your course, for all students in your program digitally. And you can basically keep a record, a progressive record of student information from course to program term wise, and collect hundreds of data points of information regarding to their skills. So here there's some advising notes and whether it's viewed by student or not, and those details. So the advising module, and you can go per student. It's not a program level evaluation here. It is an individual student level evaluation. So you could see what every student's performance is term wise, year wise, and you can, the powerful thing about this is you can have a student with all red, performances, and then you could see a consistent green. For example, he's always good in communication, or he's always good in some kind of drawing skills, or he's always good in critically analyzing things. So you'll see a green stand out when you analyze it carefully. And that kind of helps you identify the God-given inherent strengths, which is implanted in every creation, every human to survive. So with a proper system that can analyze and evaluate this, you can extract those skills which are strong even in academically poor students, and then direct them on career paths that are aligned to their inherent strong skills. So this is the beauty of specific performance indicators and digital academic records. You can go into those details and get those specific pieces of information. So this is the process flow. We look at the quantitative, multi-term, multi-year data. Then we go and apply those performance heuristics and criteria and try to understand that. Then we go into course level information, and we look at, besides the quantitative course data, we can also look at the qualitative information or qualitative analysis of the faculty who have written some comments in their reflections inside the courses, and then come up with a cause of what the problem is and the exact solution, and document that, again assign it. So all of these are critical for bridging the skills gap to achieve real performance. So this is advising based on outcomes. You see outcomes are listed, those outcomes which are adequate and those which are satisfactory. Faculty can give specific advice. Everything is quantified and available both for the student and for the instructors to follow up on this performance model. So now let's get into one more complex area, which is classifying the difference and clarifying the difference between outcomes, skills, and competencies. Because of a big confusion in this, we find even governments, we find national qualification frameworks using them interchangeably and actually listing them again and again in qualification frameworks, and that kind of confuses everybody. So let's look into that. We look into Vestera model specifically. I'm going to come with some definitions first, then go into those models. Outcomes can be defined as a set of accessible, culminating demonstrations of knowledge, skills, and or competencies. You see over here? So outcomes can be knowledge, can be skills or competencies, all the three gain following completion of their respective learning. So they can be gained by any kind of learning experience, any level of education. They will be, but they would be aligned to a specific learning domain and learning level, and would apply to certain contexts of learning. And they will be displayed in clearly articulated and acceptable scale of performances. This is what outcomes are. So outcomes are the umbrella. Outcomes are not different from skills and competence, but outcomes are the umbrella. Skill is also an outcome, and competency is also an outcome. Now, skills are the abilities to demonstrate some learning activities with a well-defined range of performance. So there has to be a range of acceptable performance and their complexities, acceptable range of complexity to complete those tasks. Again, in specific learning domains and learning levels. Now, competency, according to Vestera, is mastery of the skills. So if you go to outcomes, they're very generic. Then you go to skills, and then when you go to the higher up of in the order of performance and complexity, you come to competency. I hope that is clear. So Vestera studied the conventional models of competency, and he extracted his own model, and we explained that. The conventional model, what it defined competency as something that needed an additional mental, involvement, cognitive involvement, an additional, you could say, specialized cognitive capability to implement that competence. That was the conventional model that Vestera he researched and he identified. And what he said in his model is competencies need not have those additional mental capabilities. In fact, competencies would be part of skills, but those skills which reflect competent behavior. So, in fact, competency could be also automatic from a level of skill achieved and may no longer require additional mental capabilities after a level of expertise and mechanism has been attained. So that's the difference between, in essence, there are a lot of more details, a beautiful paper by Vestera, and there's many aspects related to assessment, evaluation, and other matters that he has discussed. So this is the Hussain model, 2020. And you can look over here, what I have basically presented is that it deals with all kinds of knowledge, factual, conceptual, procedural, metacognitive. So competency doesn't have to be just psychomotor, because we have some national qualification frameworks talking about competencies and saying competencies are just psychomotor. That's not correct. Competencies can be knowledge, competencies can be psychomotor, competencies can also be attitudes. Competency can also be feelings, values, and affective domain aspects. So we cover all the three domains that you see here, and we go from initial elementary levels of skill to higher levels of skill. When you go to higher levels of skill, whether in defined context or undefined context, we can actually put them as competence. Like that's what Washington Accord did. Washington Accord said they need to have competence in these areas very clearly. So I like the Washington Accord. It's very well defined. And so, but that kind of detail is required. You cannot just sum up a national level, requirement in one page and in 8 levels. You cannot do that. It's very difficult to go back and get them back into practicality in institutions and into students. You can't. So this is a very interesting. Now, you see here, this is a lot of information. And I'm going to leave it here for a few seconds, but I would like you to go back and review this slide, just reverse it a little bit and review this slide so that you can grab the essence of the differences in the Vestera and as well as, yes, in this. So just a second, we need to get Dr. Sumit in. Let me just message. 1 second. One second, please. He just kind of lost connection. Okay, so let me just spell out just a couple of things here. If you look at Vestera model and Hussein model, it talks about competencies being just higher order skills as absolute mastery. And then when you look into the Hussein model, what we say is that competency could be a high order skill as well as any other definition which you want as an educator. Maybe you want not the best of the rest. Maybe you want some intermediate skill at a certain level of your education, and you would set it as the competence required for that performance. So it totally depends on the educator, the educational context, and the educational system. So competencies, according to Westergaard, he says it's cognitive, but we say it could be cognitive, knowledge, or psychomotor skills. So, and he also says Westergaard, the attitudes are inputs to develop skills and competencies. What we say are attitudes, behavior, values are all components of affective domain skills. So they are not external, but they're also a part of this process of developing skills. So I'm not going to go into exact details of everything here, but I'll leave this up for you to refer to because that would require another explanation. Now, let me go into some crucial aspects before we have to close. You see economies are shifting dramatically. The definition of capital has changed from physical assets to human capital. So what we're looking into is health, skills, quality of living, productivity, earnings. Now, these are more crucial in what defines an economy and a country. So the old times wherein natural resources were the only form of capital are redefined now, and all the economies are changing, and now there's a recognition of human capital. Human is the most important resource, and that's why the importance of education is tremendous. We have a shift in the global economies. This is all from the International Labour Organization, excellent material from rural to urban, and we have a shift of populations very clearly, and we see here that the composition of global employment is changing dramatically. So I leave this to you to look into and understand the gravity of the situation. We see here also the change in the kind of jobs that will come up in the next few years. We see also in this other slide uh, the demand for different kind of jobs and skills for those jobs either decreasing or increasing, and so it's crucial to focus into human capital now for the betterment of countries, economies, and the world, and the quality of living. So here, what becomes very important is how to define quality of education. Is it at par? How do we measure whether those skills of students are actually being attained? And that's why now the term quality assurance in higher education is increasingly used to denote the practices whereby academic standards are actually referred to student learning outcomes. How do we identify whether the level of desired quality is achieved at every level of the education process? So it's now equivalent to student learning outcomes, and there's a major shift internationally. This is a snapshot information from 2011, but a lot of things have changed into now national education are mandating to review qualification standards based on the educational outcomes or learning outcomes. You see how critical that becomes. And we have another example how national strategies and initiatives are based on outcomes. The sustainability and development goals of UNESCO based on outcomes. You find uh, uh, UNESCO documents showing 100 countries mandating the use of national operation frameworks and systems based on outcomes. So let me come over to the next slide here, which is the national qualification systems. We talk about what's the definition, what are the components of national qualification systems, and what's the causal framework for this. Now, any country, if it wants to regulate skills and education using comprehensive national qualification systems, then it has to make sure that the implementation of that national qualification system is based on the right theoretical frameworks. The causal chain is very properly connected so that the necessary skills and the improvement and attainment of those can actually happen. Coles and Workin, they said that national qualification system, it's a broad concept. It includes all aspects of country's activity resulting in the recognition of learning. It includes the means of developing, implementing policy on qualifications, institutional arrangements, skills identification arrangements, and processes for assessment, awarding, and quality assurance. The European qualification framework is based on learning outcomes for all types of qualifications, providing clarity, portability, and comparability of formal, informal learning across different countries and institutions. Very nice. So this is what is very key here. If there are any inaccuracies in developing essential frameworks of these key educational interventions, the causal interconnections, the system-wide implementation process, the evaluation of impact, uh, it would prove ineffective in arresting the increasing skills gap. And so that could result in several hundred billion to trillions of dollars worth of GDP growth for G20 economies. There's a nice report by UK Consultancy 2018. So what are the key components of the NQS? Institutional infrastructure for governance, funding, operations, quality assurance, a theoretical framework for outcome-based learning and the assessment methodology and models, a hierarchical structure, a hierarchical structure, of qualifications that define vertical progression with qualification system. So these are essential aspects of qualification system. So one is qualification framework, the theoretical framework, the infrastructure for governance, funding, the quality standards for development of curricula, the internationally benchmarked qualifications and CQI methodology system and processes, the accreditation agencies, the accredited programs providing credit and competency-based education, credit systems that validate formal, informal education and enable transfer. So these are the essential components of the national qualification system. Now, here we are putting in, with respect to quality, the four major components of the quality assurance or management of the national education system. So we have quality standards coming from national qualification frameworks. We have quality control coming from the accreditation agencies, I can see on the top. And then we have quality monitoring with national testing. And of course, even through accreditation. And then we have these institutional educational elements, which form the major criteria for almost every accreditation agency, like student enrollment, education, graduation advising, graduate attributes, program outcomes, curriculum, continuous quality improvement, infrastructure facilities, the faculty, and community service and research. So these are the standard educational elements that are basically regulated by national quality systems through their qualification frameworks and change and implementation elements. So let's look at the OECD definition of national qualification framework. I'm not going to go into much details of this, but I'm just going to point out a few matters. It's an instrument for the development and classification of qualifications. It shows the level of learning achieved. The set of criteria may be implicit or made explicit. The scope of the frameworks may be comprehensive of all learning achievement and pathways, or may be confined to a certain sector. Some frameworks may have more design elements and tighter structure than others. But the common thing is all qualification frameworks establish a basis for improving the quality, accessibility, linkage, and public or labor market recognition of qualification with the country and internationally. So we're going to focus here on certain aspects of national qualification frameworks. It's the policy goals for national qualification frameworks. So a key goal of the national qualification framework are to enhance employers' comprehension of the prospect recruits' qualifications in terms of skills and competencies, and also to support individuals who are disadvantaged, underprivileged by the prevalent education systems, people whose students whose skills were not recognized, who needed opportunity and incentive to learn and contribute to the needs of the labor market. So these are two essential policy goals of national qualification frameworks. Let's look into the role of learning outcomes. From all of these references, we find that since the late 1990s, learning outcomes have become a very crucial and major player in steering the formation of national qualification frameworks, in defining them, and in forming the basic components of education systems, to provide course for curriculum, assessment methods, teacher learning, teaching and learning, pedagogy, the instructional time, the essential elements of an education system. All of them would basically be tied up to national qualification frameworks through the educational outcomes and learning outcomes that are used to prescribe them. So the use of learning outcomes has become more established, and emerging frameworks, uh, they actually have used learning outcomes as a basis for descriptors, and a common language for sectors of education and training, trying to make the education system more coherent and permeable. So let's look at some examples here. This is the UNESCO uh, reference which I talked about. It shows more than 100 countries, all of them mandating, it's a 2090 production, but all of them mandating learning outcomes based qualification frameworks. So now, are the qualification frameworks doing their job, or we have more to do to improve and enhance this? So if you look into the, the general concept, the national qualifications framework consists of the learning domains and their learning levels with appropriate descriptors. These domains vary across various countries and specific areas of learning. Bateman and Coles 2012, they note that learning outcomes and the level descriptors in any given qualification framework reflect a country's education training system and qualifications with relevant context to the history and economy of that country. And they say that, as we talked earlier, NQFs can be sectoral or comprehensive. Now, the core elements of NQFs are learning domains, levels of learning, which can be 6 to 12, domains of learning, which could be generally 3 to 4, the levels descriptors, the rules for classification of qualification, and then we have the rules for the volume of learning that contributes towards the qualification. So these are the essential elements of national qualification frameworks. We see India also adopting the national education policy, shifting towards competency-based education and the focus on closing the gap again, a recognized gap, and closing that gap in achieving learning outcomes. Classroom transactions will shift towards competency-based learning and education. And basically, they're saying the assessment tools will also be aligned with learning outcomes, capabilities, and dispositions, uh, depending on the context of the particular class. Now, this is Saudi Arabia. We see here again a revision of the national qualification frameworks from the previous model to the new. So we have knowledge, skills, and competencies. And I've talked earlier about the difference between these skills, competencies, and outcomes, and why, when you actually separate them in this matter, you may reach a certain type of redundancy. And in fact, you cannot approach a certain skill without a certain amount of knowledge. You cannot reach a certain amount of competency without a certain skill. So a lot of redundancy comes up when you start defining qualification frameworks with domains related to outcomes, skills, and competencies, and even classifying competencies as just psychomotor or affective or cognitive. But the moment here is clearly there to achieve a focus more from an economy which is resource based, natural resource based, to a knowledge based economy. There is a major job and skills mismatch. This is a great study, uh, Crawford and Fink, and 2020 study, and they've looked at 2,700 employees, 1,400 alumni, 2,500 students, 1,300 faculty members, and about 11,400 plus responses in their survey, an APLU survey, and they found a clear misalignment in priorities of employers and academic institutions. Very interesting. Now you see over here, you have all these 11 skills, like skill one, understand role in the workplace and have realistic career expectations. And you find that the employer feels that students, they do not have that kind of understanding. And we find that faculty members and educators, they're quite confident that students have that understanding. But clearly, we find a gap between the understanding of employers and understanding of educators, and the requirement and significance of these skills with employers, and the preparedness and readiness of the students who just graduated. Faculty members indicate otherwise, but employers say the truth, and they are basically talking about a big mismatch in skills in these graduates. This is the UK 2018 research, and we're talking about a shortage and inability to supply skills, leading to almost $12 trillion GDP deficit in the next 10 years. And they've given a nice uh, report here to look into. I will leave that as well for you and with the reference to look into. But where is this all pointing us to? It is pointing us to the fact that, or to the question, that do national qualification frameworks and systems, are they actually doing their part, or we still have a lot of enhancement and a lot of effort to work on? So Allies 2010 International Labour Organization report is very important. I'm sure there are many more pieces of work available now. But what he said is they found little evidence that national qualification frameworks had actually substantially improved conversations between education systems and labor markets. Employers found national qualification frameworks practically easy to use, and the gap required skills and education had reduced. So they just didn't find that. There was little evidence for that. So what are the reasons for these problems? Uh, in our expert opinion, we have listed a few of these, but there are many more aspects. One is inaccurate selection of domains and definition of their learning levels. The other is limited comprehension, not covering relevant education sectors and specialized. They're mostly generic. But when you have a generic descriptors, how do you apply that into certain specific specializations? Because I've seen some national qualification frameworks, descriptors, writing some description that may not apply to medical science, may not be relevant. I have seen some description talking about autonomous behavior and research, which really doesn't happen in reality. We see learning domains that are overlapping other learning domains. And we see a lack of learning progression. So when you don't have a learning progression and you just have one descriptor there, how do the other levels climb up to the level which is expected? So that detail for every single level and with the vertical progression is missing. So these are some key problems, because when you define a qualification or a performance or an expectation, you have to also define how you get up to that, and how each level of education relates to the other level of education. When you don't have this, and there's a disconnect clearly, and there are some arbitrary ad hoc representations of those performances and qualifications, it becomes difficult to implement them. And they are just showcase frameworks. That's what we call them. They are showcase frameworks that cannot be absorbed, cannot be enforced by accreditation. So it just stays in those forms, unfortunately, and in those ritualistic fill up of forms, but no real improvement happening in students. The alignment uh, doesn't happen. There's no real accurate alignment with the emerging skills of specific sectors because it's not specialized. So they don't pick up the emerging skills from certain sectors. And uh, all of these national qualification framework, they say they are based on learning outcomes. But when you look at the language is substandard. The language which is mentioned in some of the national qualification frameworks is not learning outcome language. You cannot develop curriculum, you cannot develop learning or teaching from that language. Some of that language is even futuristic. Some of that language is unattainable. It cannot be demonstrated. So this is a stark contrast. And all these matters are something that we have to look into. Now, this is an example from level 1 to level 8. You see how the progression takes place from level 1 to level 8. Uh, in fact, you don't really see much progression. You just see some descriptors here. But what do you mean by basic general knowledge? What do you mean by highly specialized knowledge? And how do you get to that? Where is the learning outcome standards here? And how do you apply it to a certain specialization? Now, why skills are isolated from knowledge? Why can't you just define outcomes or skills rather than separating knowledge from skills? Because you cannot produce some kind of skills without the essential knowledge. What is measurable are skills. Knowledge is by itself not measurable unless it's displayed, demonstrated in a certain action. So you should be focusing on skills and focusing on competencies and outcomes and mentioning those very clearly. And if you look into responsibility and those aspects, there are many other aspects in the affected domain that have to be focused. Just being autonomous is not sufficient. There are ethics, there are standards, there is behaviors and attitudes. There's a consideration of societal aspects, environmental aspects, global aspects. All of that will fall into ethics and affected domain. So we need a more comprehensive and detailed effort. If you really want to make a comparison of national qualification frameworks, implementation of them across countries, then there has to be more description here. There has to be more detail here. Every level has to be expounded, and every level has to connect with the other level. So these are some issues. So we should actually talk about accurate learning domains, the learning levels. All of the forms of knowledge should be covered: factual, conceptual, procedure, and metacognitive. The learning domains should not, or the national qualification framework should not just focus on a certain aspect of knowledge, but rather a comprehensive perspective of knowledge. So this is basically a sample of the three skills grouping methodology, where we're trying to, at a very, you can say, elementary format, implement this learning progression, but it could be more complex for certain specializations at certain levels. So you see over here, this is a paper by Sedefop in 2018, and they're talking about metacognitive knowledge happening at a very senior level, level 8 of the levels of the qualification frameworks. But metacognition can happen at level 1, can happen level 8. And we are talking about the different kinds of cognitive information here on the right hand side. And you see how create and evaluate starts happening at a very senior level of learning in level 8. Once again, this can happen at all levels of these qualification, and they should happen at all levels. But the application and the complexity will vary, and that has to have clear descriptors. And once again, you need to be very sectoral here. So you see, there are some examples here, which I don't want to go into the details, but I will conclude in 1 or 2 slides talking about these problems which we have or see in the national qualification frameworks and the lack of clear definition between what is knowledge, what is skills, what is competence, and how to extract the learning outcomes, assessment, evaluation, accreditation standards from these. All of these are significant issues. So we see over here, uh, you see in this example, you see theoretical, factual, but ways metacognitive and procedural. And then we see skills here. Are these just psychomotor? And then in competence, we look into autonomy, responsibility, practice, and attributes. So the question here is, why do we have only high standards, extremely high standards? And some of them are not aligned with the student career. And where are the values, ethics, and standards in this? So why do we separate cognitive skills into knowledge? All of these are quite problematic, and there's a lot of redundancy also. If you look into them, there's redundancy here. So with that said, I will open the floor to some questions. Hamza, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them at this point. uh, so do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Okay. Yeah. So one major question that I'd like to answer is, now what could we do in each of these situations where we have national qualification frameworks in place? What can we do to improve them? So I would end with this answer. Number one, national qualification frameworks, they should list all major sectors and specializations, informal and formal. And they should be applicable to needs and the configuration of a dynamic national economy. The scope of the frameworks should not be connected to all the different kinds of learning and generic, but be aligned to a particular sector and specialization. The domains and their level descriptors should incorporate the needs and emerging skills of the labor market while observing rules for minimal mapping redundancy. For example, by the learning domains Venn diagram wheel, which I talked about earlier. The set of criteria should not be implicit, but it should be actually explicit in a hierarchical structure, showing vertical progression in learning built up with a set of level descriptors for each domain and the levels of learning. Not just giving the highest level of learning, but rather giving a progression of learning. Each level of qualification should be further structured into its levels of learning to enable ease of implementation of learning progression by institutions and programs and facilitate credible quality assurance and accurate evaluation by accreditation agencies, because that would actually help accreditation agencies. The domains, levels, and details of level descriptors should be categorized accurately for each sector. So they shouldn't be generic domains and learning levels, but they should be categorized, because when you really evaluate them for the business, law, medical, or for the engineering specializations, or for any other specialization, do you think the same kind of learning or the same kind of descriptors would apply? Well, I don't think so. And there's a lot of experts who do not agree. And these are the major reasons why we find the qualification frameworks not able to integrate with accreditation agencies or educational institutions, and they remain at a superficial form of implementation with mostly form filling and trying to fill up the checklists and to show accreditation agencies that schools, institutions are actually, fulfilling the criteria prescribed by the national regulations. So with this, I would like to conclude this workshop, and we thank you very much for your participation and hope to see you again for the remaining sessions. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and hope all the best for you. Thank you very much and goodbye.